starts with your surface preparation before you start putting on any veneer on the outside. And so right here you see all the windows are in, everything's taped off nicely, everything's done to close the house up. And at this point you could even do a blower door test to check your air tightness, and if you maybe forgot some seams or some nail holes, you can go and patch that up real quick. Another thing to note, in this picture you can see those windows at the bottom. Basically the windowsill is not taped, so that flange is left just nailed on there but not taped over. And so what that does is it allows water, if it did end up getting into or through your window, it'll hit your sloped sill that you made during the framing stage. That's also important to slope it a couple of degrees to allow water to drain out. And so leaving that open with no tape allows that water to exit if you get into that sort of situation down the road. And here inside of the shed there we have all the materials staged. So as you can see, it's quite a lot. 2-ply felt paper, and also you've got the metal lath, a diamond extruded metal lath, and this one is self-spacing, so it has dimples in it. Some places they just call them dimpled lath. What that does is it spaces it off the wall to allow space about a 1/4 inch behind that lathing, and your building sheathing or your felt paper for that mortar to get through and actually bind nicely with your lathing material. Now we're looking at it being installed on the building. So what you do is this felt paper, you can buy it in 2-ply, which is basically in the roll it has 2 sheets of paper on top of one another, and when you roll it out, it rolls them both out simultaneously, so you get, as you roll it out once, you get 2 layers of that paper. You definitely need to make sure you have 2 layers of waterproofing on there, because the first layer of felt paper is going to serve as a sacrificial layer, so that when the Type S mortar or your stucco mix or any masonry you put on there, it's going to bind to that paper and basically penetrate it, and that first layer that's touching your masonry will lose its water shedding and air barrier qualities, and so the second layer in behind is going to act as the water shedding layer, while the first one is sacrificial to allow the mortar to bind to it. And then after here, you see in this picture there's quite a bit of corners. Outside corners are a little easier to handle. You can just bend it over with your hands across the outside corner, but inside corners I would recommend getting some sort of I think we used an axe type tool that was dulled on the front, or like some sort of wedge, and you can wedge it in there and kind of hit it with a hammer to bend it into those corners. You just got to be very careful to make sure you don't accidentally scrape or penetrate that waterproofing layer. And then here you can see that staples are used and they're wide crown staples to fasten the metal lath onto the wall, and they're spaced about I'd say 6 to 8 inches apart in all directions. And most of these mats have dimples in them, and if you look closer in that picture you can see you kind of want to try to get those staples into those dimples, and those dimples also can provide pretty nice spacing for you, so it's easier to keep track of your 6 to 8 inch spacing on those staples. And spacing requirements may vary. You might want to consult the engineer who designed your exterior system, or maybe the product manufacturer, depending on the weight of your masonry that you're attaching to this. You might need more, or you could go with less staples. And right here is a video of that in action. You have that pneumatic staple gun is probably the quickest way to go. You can also use screws if you're going straight into metal studs, but if you have 3/4 OSB sheathing, you don't have to hit studs. You can just hit anywhere in that plane with 6 to 8 inch spacing. And so right here is a little bit further along in the process. Another thing to mention is you can see that green area where the zip sheathing is still visible hasn't been done yet. you don't want to do everything in felt paper and then come back the next day or the next week and do everything with the lathing. You kind of want to do a couple rows of felt paper and then put the lath right on top of it right away, because if you have a rain event that happens in between you putting on the lath, the felt paper and the lath, or some sort of windstorm comes by, it doesn't take much to rip your felt paper off the wall. So to save yourself the headache of having to redo any felt paper, it's best to put the lath right over it as you install it. Another thing to mention is when you do your felt paper, you want to make sure the joints are overlapping in a shingle-like fashion. So you start from the bottom and work your way to the top. The next row overlapping bottom row usually they have a line striped onto your felt paper, which tells you how much to overlap in both vertical and horizontal directions. And each manufacturer might have a slightly different recommendation, so you might just make sure you read up on the felt paper manufacturing and install instructions on those overlap requirements. And also your lathing, you also want to overlap. I think we were doing about 4 inches to 6 inches overlap on this. That also, I think 2 inches might be minimum, but that's all. You want to check with your local building codes to make sure you're up to date on that. And here you can see that we installed, right here we're going to have stone veneer on the bottom, and then on the top portion where that green zip system is still visible is going to be stucco. And so you want to make sure you have the proper flashing over your stone sill. So right there, that's a stone sill kick out flashing that's put on there as the water runs down the stucco, it'll hit that flashing and run over the stone cap or whatever other masonry, different material you have under there. Or you could also have other examples, could be you're doing some siding under there. You also want to use some quick kick out flashing to provide that nice clean separation, both visually and for the water to be able to run over your material instead of running behind it. And then in this picture it shows in fireproofing situations where you have, in this case it was a zip R system, so you have that foam, the zip system sheathing. The zip system was taped and sealed, and then on top of that there was 5/8 inch dense glass that was put on top to provide that fireproofing rating if you have other buildings in close vicinity, or if your local fire codes require that. And so that fireproofing material is usually going to be 5/8 gypsum board, exterior rated if you're on the outside. In this case it was GP dense glass, and those ones, although they're exterior grade, they're only meant to be exposed to the elements for the period of the construction, but for long term they have to be protected from the water, else they will deteriorate over time. So that's why you see the Tyvek placed over that, and then on top of the Tyvek you then have to put on the felt paper, again 2-ply, and then your lathing. Now, important thing to recognize here, you have to penetrate your into a stud the proper depth or through the structural sheathing, 3/4 sheathing. And to achieve that, if you have some sort of other material like dense glass in between the lath you're stapling on and the sheathing, you have to go with longer staples. I think we use 2-inch staples in this case to be able to get that depth to actually get into the sheathing, because your dense glass is not going to be able to hold the weight of your masonry properly. And then right here what you see is we call them leveling channels installed, or they're control joints, basically metal control joints. And so what these do is basically the profile is kind of a shape of an M, or they might call them V channels some places. And what it is you can get them in different depths depending on how thick your stucco is going to be. These, in this case, I think they were 3/4, so that's the the thickness of your base coat and final coat. So what you're doing with this is when you're doing your brown coat on top of your scratch coat, that brown coat needs to be perfectly flat and level. And the easiest way to achieve this is by installing these strips at intervals that are closer together than your screed board. And we use an aluminum screed, which is like a 2x4 but made out of aluminum, or you can get them in magnesium, and you just run it across that and it screeds the excess material off and it leaves a perfect level surface. And there's also corner beads that are installed on the corners, and the way you install those is you pull them off of the edge. You don't want them flat against the corner. You pull them off and you place your screed across two of your control joints, and then you let it overhang where the corner is, and then you pull the bead out to where the edge of that bead is contacting your screed, so that way it's flat from your corner across the flat face across your control joints to the other corner, and you also use a level to make it plumb. And so you pull it off and you staple it in place, and you do your scratch coat pretty carefully around that. And once your scratch coat sets, that thing's pretty rigid, and you can run your screed pretty easily once you're doing your brown coat across that. Make sure everything's nice and flat and even. Right here we have the whole building when the process is finished. So everywhere where you see those control joints, which are those silver lines of those V channels going vertically at the edges of the windows, that's where the stucco will be installed. And then in that middle section you see there's no V joints visible right there. That's because that'll all be stone veneer, and you don't need to screed anything for stone veneer. You just make it flat approximately by hand when you're doing your scratch coat. Now the next step in this process is really important, because you don't want to damage any other finish materials you have on, which will be your soffit and any boxes that are going to be there, any roof overhangs, any concrete on the bottom, windows. Everything needs to be masked off so that the concrete doesn't stick to it, so that when you paint your stucco primer or the stucco itself doesn't stick to these things, because it's very hard, if not impossible, to wash them off afterwards. Type S mix you could get away washing off of most materials like windows and stuff like that, but it's best practice to keep it masked off, because elastomeric finishes you're not going to be able to get off, and you don't want to ruin your final product doing this. And so there's a couple of methods of installing masonry systems. This one is we're using the traditional 3-coat system for the stucco, and for the stone veneer we're doing a scratch coat, and then after the scratch coat dries we're attaching the stone veneer using stone veneer adhesive onto that scratch coat. This really serves two purposes. For stone veneer you could do a wet scratch, or basically you just scratch as you install your stone veneer. So you kind of impregnate some stone veneer adhesive into your metal lathing, and then you attach your stone right on top of that. Some people argue that it provides better bond strength because it's wet mortar on wet mortar, but in this case we thought it was better to go with the scratch coat approach, let it dry, and then install the stone veneer. For a couple of reasons. One is you can do scratch coat for the whole entire building first for stucco and stone, and then do your stucco and then finish up with your stone, and it puts all of your scratch coating into one process. And if you're using a mechanized approach with sprayers and pumps, it's easier to get that done all at once rather than coming back and doing it again or while you're doing your stone. And also it provides more structural integrity with your finish, because when you add that scratch coat, that's about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch thick concrete continuous sheathing basically that you put on the outside of your building, in addition to your structural OSB sheathing. And so it really adds some rigidity to the structure itself, and is just more robust in general. So one of the methods is to use a pump, or a mortar pump and sprayer. So this one right here is a diesel powered engine that runs a mortar pump, and it has its own air compressor. And right here is the setup we used in the beginning, which is this is a Graco Tough Tech continuous mixer. It's their CM20. It's the one of the smaller models they have, and these continuous mixers are great for these sort of applications. It really saves you time and labor costs, because you can have one guy making continuously mortar for the whole day. And right here, it's all on a flatbed truck, and we have pallets in the back. There you can see it's Parex, and that's for the brown coat. And for the scratch coat, we actually used Type S mix that we got from Lowe's. You can get it from probably most of your local hardware stores. Be able to sell those, like the big stores, Home Depot and Lowe's, or you can get it from a Stucco supply as well. Type X is a lot stronger than the other brown coats that you would use, because for the scratch coat, you can allow it to crack. Those cracks won't be visible because they'll be covered up by your brown coat and finish coat if you're doing stucco, or by the stone when you're doing a stone veneer finish. So we can go with a stronger material like Type S, which has a lot more strength but is more prone to cracking. But then when you go onto your brown coat, which is your second coat, which makes it flat, which you adhere your color coat onto, and that you don't want cracking, because if that cracks, then it'll show through to your final finish. So for that, you want to use a sort of fibered mix. This is pretty good. Usually has fibers inside of it to prevent micro cracks, and also it's a lower strength mix, so it's less prone to cracking. And here we have the video of the application going with the mortar pump, the spray tip, and this is probably the quickest way to do it if you have a lot of people available to smooth it out afterwards. You can do quite a lot of this, multiple houses in one day, scratch coating with a mortar pump like this, and it sprays it on, and the continuous mixer just keeps feeding it. And then you want to use I like using a pull trowel, and you push all of the mortar into the lathing material. Make sure it gets nice up behind there, and you want to leave about a 1/4 inch of material to cover up the lath to where you can't see the dimples. So right here I would want to put more material on to where the dimples are not visible. They're basically covered by 1/4 inch material, and then when you go to scratch, it'll leave you 1/4 inch scratches on there, which will allow your next coat to adhere better. In this next photo, this is showing the brown coat, and that's your flat coat when it's flattened out with your control joints. Now, important thing to mention is if you're doing stone veneer, you want it to be flat, nice, so it's easier to do your stone on that afterwards, but you don't have to be as careful as with stucco. With stucco, for your scratch coat, you have to make sure that everywhere is below your control joints that you're going to be screening across over when you're doing your brown coat, because if there's anything that's sticking up with your scratch coat, you're going to have a really tough time getting your brown coat to be nice and flat, and you might have cracking if your scratch coat doesn't leave enough space, which is at least 1/2 inch for your brown coat, to have the proper thickness to not crack. And then right here there's a video of a smaller structure being done from a wheelbarrow. It's also scratch coating by hand. You can use just a pull trowel and a hawk to get that on there. And with practice, you can get pretty fast at this. And the most cost-effective method we found was actually using this pneumatic type tool. And so you scoop out of a wheelbarrow to fill it up with material, and it just sprays onto the wall. It's a really quick and easy way of applying the mortar with little skill. It just really pushes it in good to the lathing, and then all you have to do after that is smooth it out with a trowel. Really nice thing. And with this approach, as well as the mortar pump approach, what you want to be doing is just going over it with a Darby, serrated Darby even, if you want it to dry faster, and then scratch coat it with a scratcher to make those scratch marks. There's no need to travel too much with this stuff if you apply it pretty uniformly. And the best part of it is this tool only costs about $50, and you can get it on Amazon. Get it in a couple of days, and it's really cost effective. We went through, I think, 4 or 5 of these tools for this whole building. So you can get about $250 on this tool. It does clog up eventually after you do so much material through it. But if you really take care of it, it'll last you a while. And it certainly ends up being cheaper than going with a mortar pump, which can be complicated, requires a lot of manpower to run, a lot of maintenance issues with that. With this thing, it's cheap and dispensable, and it gets the job done pretty fast. Now moving along, we have the scratch coat pretty much finished, and then we got the brown coat finished right here, where these windows are taped off. See, it's nice and flat, and you can maybe see some flakes of the fibers sticking out. And with the brown coat, it doesn't have to be perfectly glass smooth finish. In fact, what you do is, but you want it to be perfectly level and flat. So you get that flat by screeding it, and then you want to go over it lightly with a pool trowel to kind of smooth it out. And then after that, you're going to use a sponge trowel and kind of go over it. It's a kind of a figure 8 motion, or even side to side might work depending on how watery the material is. But you want it to wait for it to set to where it's fingerprint hard, and then go over it with that sponge trowel to give it a texture for your color coat to adhere to properly. And another thing to mention is with these continuous mixtures, the Graco Continuous Mixture 20, they have this bushing at the top end that the mixing rod sits in, and you want to make sure you keep that lubricated with grease, because if you don't, it will start rocks start getting into there, and it starts to burn the plastic, and it seizes up on you pretty quick if you don't make sure you grease it at least once every day, if not more. And right here we have the next step would be, after you have your brown coat in, you want to do your accents. If you're doing bricks around windows or moldings, some people do styrofoam type moldings around windows. You want to attach those right now to the brown coat, so then when you do the colored coat, you can go right up against the finish. In this case, it's going to be bricks there around those windows, or if it's a molding type thing, you can go right over the molding and make it look nice and uniform. Just make sure with these bricks, we did tape over them to prevent any of that elastomeric stucco finish from splashing onto those bricks, because that's really tough to wash off. As you can see, this process gets pretty dirty, pretty messy. This shirt has been washed a couple of times. That stucco isn't coming off anytime soon. These boots, so you're going to make sure you're wearing clothes you're okay with getting muddied up. And then you want to choose your finishes. Nice thing to do is you want to get samples of your stucco and your stone and compare them to make sure colors match, and that you're going to be happy with the finish in the end. And you want to bring it out to the site, to the house or building you're working on, to see it in those light conditions, because light can change perception of the color pretty easily. Right here we use Parex elastomeric finishes. They're nice, they're acrylic based. That means you can wash your tools with water, and it's highly flexible, 100% acrylic. Basically, if you have any hairline cracks that develop in your brown coat, those will be covered up with your elastomeric finish, and because it's flexible, you'll be able to kind of stretch and contract to a certain degree to kind of mitigate those smaller hairline cracks from occurring. But again, if you have a pretty big mess up in your brown coat that ends up cracking a lot, it's not going to be able to cover anything bigger than a hairline crack. But if you do the job done, you shouldn't have any cracks visible after you got your finish coat on. So right here, this actually is the primer, which is tinted in the same tint as the Parex base finish color coat, and that is so that to cover up if there's any sort of pinholes that you develop with air, or that you don't get kind of full coverage everywhere, or when you're doing your swirl marks, if you're doing a type of swirl finish on there, when you're swirling it, you can get basically what they have in there is little tiny granules or pebbles of sand that swirl around and make those score marks to create the texture. And so if they're scratching against an unprimed brown coat, then you might get some of that gray cement looking material to be viewable once it's done. So if you're doing a swirl, highly recommend getting a tinted primer. It's not that much. It does cost quite a bit more than regular paint, but one bucket goes a long way. And you basically paint over it with a roller, or you can spray apply it with the airless sprayer. And once that dries, it primes the surface to accept the acrylic color coat a lot better, and also it keeps your color nice and uniform, prevents that gray from showing through to your final finish. And then right here, after you're done with that, you can put your stucco on, and then you're ready for stone. So it's always advised to do stucco before stone, because stucco is messy and stone can be done pretty cleanly without a lot of droppings, while stucco, if it splashes onto your stone, then you got a bigger problem. Like in this way, there's no way that your stone's going to get damaged by the stucco. And you want all your penetrations to be done nice, sealed. Right here we have a dryer outlet that's been placed there before the scratch coats in the stone, so that it's nice and air and water sealed to your main water barrier, which is going to be your Tyvek or your zip system, or whatever other system you might be using. And this is from afar with all of the stucco completed. Another thing to mention is make sure, as you can see here, as we finished the stucco, we peeled off the window covering, because in the sun the stucco tape and those protective coverings will kind of deteriorate, and you might have a harder time taking them off if they're out in the sun for more than a month or two. And right here, we actually completed this whole project using this Genie X60 lift, and I think it has like an 8 or 10 foot wide bucket that two people could fit in there pretty comfortably and do scratch coat and stucco. If you have more people, then you should consider probably going to some sort of scaffolding to be able to fit more people on. But in this not a lot of people working on this at a time, so this worked perfectly for us, rather than having to set up all of that scaffolding, which requires a lot of time and money to rent that out or buy it. And here you can see the nice swirl finish. This was done. It was a medium swirl or a fine swirl, if I can remember correctly. And the way you do the swirl is you want to get a plastic trowel. The one I used here was actually a fiberglass trowel that I got from the stucco shop. And you want to do figure 8 movements with your hand, and you don't want to press too hard at all. You just lay the trowel down, and just the weight of the trowel is all you need really, and you very lightly swirl it around, and you don't want to overdo it, because once you overdo it, you basically have to take out your metal trowel, add some more material on, and then do the process all over again. You just want to pass everything nice and evenly and get an even swirl on there, so you don't have any darker or lighter areas where it might have swirled more or less. And another thing is, when you're applying this material on, you're going to apply it with using a pool trowel, and I would apply it liberally, maybe quarter to half inch thick. Just glob it on there as fast as you can, because this stuff dries really quickly, and you don't want to be working with it in windy conditions or sunny conditions. We did all of this in very early morning, 6 a.m. to maybe 9 or 10 a.m. And then once you get past 11 a.m. in the summer, they're really you're gonna have a tough time working with this stuff because it dries so quickly. So just in the mornings is the best because your base is cool and the outside temperature is cool. In the evening it'll work too in the summertime. We didn't have any experience with it in the wintertime, but if you're working in the summer, definitely keep it in the shade. Don't work sunny areas. Get up early or do it at night when it's nice and cool so it doesn't dry on you. And when you apply it liberally, very thick. Overdo it as you're in. Apply the whole area at once and then go back to where you started and do little sections at a time. Never do more than one of these sections in between the two joints, and let that dry and then do the next one because it dries too quickly. If it's just one person doing it, it'll be overwhelming to get that done before it dries. And what you want to do is then you scrape it off with your metal trowel after you came back to where you first started applying it, to a thickness of about the thickest aggregate size inside of your swirl. So you don't want to press too hard, otherwise you're going to get rid of your swirl grains and you're going to end up with a flat finish instead of a nice textured finish, the way the product's designed to be. So you want to practice this. You'll kind of get the touch after doing it a couple times, to where the thickness is maybe an 1/8 inch, to where you have those all of your granulations of swirl in there, and then you just lightly swirl it and you're done.